Preparing live stream. It says we are live, but I don't quite.
Look at that.
That was immediate. That was like instantaneous. But I'm gonna wait until YouTube confirms this with me, because I think we get redirected to the actual. Yeah, here we go.
We can watch the stream while we're streaming.
We can watch ourselves. Yes, we could be our own audience
and ask questions in the chat.
Okay, yeah. Here we are, and we have a chat. Nice. Hello, YouTube. Hi, YouTube. I'm gonna just type that. And what happens if and sorry, folks who are just tuning in, if anyone is tuning in yet, we're just trying to figure this out. First time.
Make sure to throw money our way.
Yes, please give us money. That'd be awesome. I don't know. Yeah, okay, good. So now we're the Brady Bunch style. So 3 of us are there. Cool. And let's just share this around. I'm just gonna like post this on Twitter really quick. Growing Down is live. Join us for a Q&A. So yeah, if anybody wants to, we are going to be looking at the comment section, so feel free to share your questions and reflections on whatever the heck we're going to end up talking about today. Sharing this with our Integral Left group too. So, where do we want to get started? I have just recently watched Who Senses the Sense Makers with Brent about the emergency. So maybe we want to unpack that first, Ryan, and maybe you'd want to go first about that, just in terms of what you had in mind exploring Brent's questions. So feel free to jump in. Yeah,
I really I appreciated Peter Lindbergh giving him a platform on the Stoa to voice some of his criticisms and concerns, and I think it was a very productive, I mean, at least in terms of starting a discussion about some of these criticisms, and even just carving out spaces in which for people to voice their critiques of the sense-making communities. And I think that's really helpful in several ways. I think just doing that is helpful for people to get a more objective perspective of their own group, right? And regardless of the content of the critique, I just think that critique is really helpful. And I think for some people who are new to some of these consciousness communities, it can have a little bit of like a culty feel. It's only in the sense that, you know, there's a spiritual component. They tend to be very insulated communities with a lot of crossover from all of the emergencia community, right? Integral and Game B and metamodernism and so forth. There's a lot of jargon. So critiques from a more mainstream, in Brent's case, a left perspective, I think are really necessary to kind of break that bubble a little bit. And I also agree with a lot of the content of the critique. And this is what I was thinking about. I think that true to spiral dynamics theory, right? Second tier, yellow, integral, whatever, there's a pushing off of green. And a lot of times they're defining their identity or group identity by pushing off of postmodern SJW, leftist, traditional first tier politics and the polarization that's occurring at that level, right? There's a desire to transcend that, the mudslinging that all of us are buried in right now on Twitter and in the cultural discourse, and people are sick and tired of that. So they want something more. They want something different. They want something that doesn't get sucked into those kind of very contentious and often very unproductive battles, right? I totally get that impulse. That's why I'm a big fan of these communities and participate in these communities myself. I think the danger with that is that there are several things about that I think can be problematic, right? And Jason Snyder and Jared were talking about this too, like on Twitter and in some of the Mimetic Meteor Slack group, and that one, I think whenever you dislike something, right, you can't really steelman it. Whenever you dislike something, you can't really separate the baby and the bathwater in any kind of nuanced way. I mean, you can, but it's a little bit more challenging when you have a real visceral allergy to something. You might not explore it as deeply. And if you don't grok those insights, in this case.
You're still live, Brian.
We still see you. Or maybe he doesn't see us.
I think he got.
Sorry,
there you go.
My internet connection is unstable. Yeah, sorry, that may be happening throughout. Hopefully not too much. Whenever you ignore some of the core insights in this case of like green or the left or postmodernism or social justice philosophy, whatever, right? You can't, I don't feel like all of the critiques are actually coming from a second tier perspective, right? Or an integral or metamodern perspective. It's actually they're kind of like modernist IDW-esque critiques that are thinking that they're integral, right? So there's kind of like a weird pre-trans fallacy kind of thing going on. And I think the second thing, and this is a little bit of my frustration with like Hall and Schmachtenberger's breakdown of the race riots and everything after George Floyd was killed. Those guys are brilliant systems thinkers, very big picture thinkers about systems theory and redesigning civilization, right? Rethinking the fundamental axioms or tautologies of civilization and how we're interacting and operating in the world. But I feel like it can be a little bit too much of like a systems bypass or some kind of systems reductionism. And I really agree with Brent's critique that the sociological and cultural, in integral terms, the lower left quadrant is kind of like underplayed in favor of like a lower right quadrant systems view. And especially when it comes to all of the chaos that ensued after George Floyd's death, there was a lot of pain, there was a lot of anger, right? There was a lot of reactivity and horror from the right, right? The left is becoming this kind of anarchic force that's destroying civilization. The left, of course, a lot of people, especially like, you know, the activist community and the Black community, very upset and very traumatized by that horrible video of this guy kneeling on his neck. And as a sense-making leader, if you ignore speaking to that pain directly in favor of very abstract systems concepts, I felt kind of like an emotional disconnection, right? I felt like, where's the embodiment? Where's the empathy? And how can we speak more directly to the pain of specifically the kind of the tradition, the history of oppression and marginalization and dehumanization of the Black community, and how such a vivid image, right? This incredibly archetypal image of oppression of a white police officer in a position of power kneeling on a Black guy's neck. I mean, that's about as bad as it gets, right? And to not speak to that, to me, felt kind of like, as a mediator, I'm kind of cringing. I'm like, if there's a large wound, you have to go right into it. You can't do some kind of systems bypass. So I think that the systems theory stuff is really cool and obviously super needed and necessary. And I'm a big fan of like Schmachtenberger and stuff, but I just feel like you have to speak to that. And there may be several reasons why they don't speak to it, right? I think there's several reasons. One is because they're white and they're afraid of getting canceled. That could be a legit thing of like, I don't want to say, like Adyashanti recently did a live stream on race. And he was like, a lot of people, you know, as a spiritual teacher, he's like, a lot of people told me, don't do this. Another one is because they feel like it's not their area of expertise. It's not their wheelhouse. So they wouldn't want to speak on something that they don't feel qualified to speak on. Maybe someone like David Hartful would be a better person to speak to these issues, right? And another one too is I think there's a kind of stigma. I'm wrapping this up. I think there's a kind of stigma in these communities about being a leftist or about caring about social justice. And actually, I think a lot of people agree with Brent, or at least have similar concerns and critiques, but they're actually too shy to voice them because they don't want to be looked at as this partisan first tier social justice-y leftist kind of a person, which is what a lot of people are trying to get away from, you know, with the whole IDW influence. And I love Brent's kind of unabashed critique and opening the discussion, and a lot of people in the chat on Zoom with his Stoa session were like, yeah, these are great. I agree with a lot of this, and you know, I was surprised to see that support because those voices are not as vocal for whatever reason. And the last thing, my last critique too, is that there's so in you know, these communities, there's so much conversation around critiquing the problematic left. And I'm like, well, if we're going to talk about authoritarianism and you know, this leftist slatted to authoritarianism, why aren't we talking about Trump? Like, why aren't we talking about the Trump administration? Or why aren't we talking about the fact that how many was it, like 7,000 bombs he dropped during the Corona period because that was like a distraction. So he's like, okay, I'm gonna like really up like hyper militarism and all kind of crazy things that the Trump administration has been doing. But it's not sexy to critique the Republicans. It's not sexy to critique Mitch McConnell, right? It's not sexy to critique all the bad things that the Trump administration is doing, because people are so sick of those, because that's all the mainstream media and the Rachel Maddow MSNBCs and CNNs are doing. But I still think that if we're going to be even-handed and objective in our critiques of culture, then why not critique the Republicans too? So that's kind of winding down this rant.
Awesome rant. Yeah. I don't know, Matt, if you want to jump in with any thoughts yet, but okay. Yeah. So yeah, as we've been talking about these past couple of weeks, the takeaway I got from Brent's conversation on the Stoa was that, you know, it's not so much that people aren't aware of these things; they're just they don't touch them, and the leadership doesn't touch them, right? And I think we see this really across the board, even in the integral theory communities, where the majority of the show producers, the content makers, tend to be white, upper middle class individuals, and they don't really either feel comfortable really doubling down on those topics or touching them in any kind of way, or they want to, in a certain sense, I know they're thinking, well, we're moving into another stage or a higher stage. We're not getting involved in the partisanship. But very often I feel like it's bypassing insofar as they haven't done that legwork to actually get what the partisan battle is all about. Because if they did get involved in the trenches, there really isn't an easy way out through that. You know, that naturally lends itself to a pathway. Because, like, I mean, look at like Michael Brooks and what he's doing, right? I mean, he's very critical of some of the extremisms of the left, and he even gets pushback from the left. I think he's taking the most integral approach he can, just in terms of trying to advocate for a progressive view, critiquing the left for its, you know, perhaps over intensities, and then he is still getting a lot of critical blowback from folks. So I don't know, like that's the kind of thing that the takeaway I got from Brent's talk was that it doesn't seem it's like I sympathize, right? Like I sympathize, because there really doesn't seem to be an easy solution for this other than just getting involved in the trenches and trying to navigate this with these sense-making techniques in mind. Like, and I haven't seen that happening within the sense-making communities like Brent's talked about. Like, to be fair, these are kind of meant to sort of be standing apart and processing these things and trying to find new ways to dialogue and to talk, right? Like you're talking about mediation. So even giving that some leeway in the sense-making communities, there's still like, I'm also frustrated by like, okay, so what are we learning? What can we do other than vent for folks who want to push back against green? Right, because I feel like in many senses, many of these communities tend to be sort of venting spaces to kind of process what's going on in the culture war, rather than actually build constructive pathways out of it. And even if that is their intention, and I'm taking them on good faith, that is their intention. But it's complicated, you know. I really sympathize. So I don't really know if I have a point exactly there, other than that's what I take away from Brent's talk. Just it's how difficult it is, but at the very least, then let's have some foundations in the sense-making community in terms of bringing in, as he says, more sociological perspectives rather than maybe purely philosophical or psychological. But the sociological is also very important as well. So if we could start there, that would be interesting, right? So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, kind of riffing on that a little bit. You brought up Michael Brooks. I know I'm reading his book right now, and I just got to the part where I really like this part where he's talking about fostering sacred meaning and group bonds and sort of the left community. And I think hopefully, and while Brent has been critical of Integral, I think most of his missiles have been aimed at the Game B emergencia crowd. And hopefully that's where Integral can kind of play that line, you know, as far as creating those pathways you're talking about. And I mean, hopefully, at least I think of this as our aim is trying to find out where those spaces are. And I know for me, you know, we're talking about the cultural war, but I know I just finished up Subtle Activism. And something that comes up for me a lot in my head is I'm not so much invested in the cultural part, and maybe that speaks a little bit to what you're saying, Ryan, but I tend to think of more, you know, you don't hear this one used as much as it used to. It's like the Holy War. You know, you think about different religions, but I think there's also different I mean, all those different parties, Game B, you know, IDW, all that stuff. I think there's also a battle of the internal side. And I know, you know, I think Brent's article that he recently posted talked about trying to come up with a consensus amongst those communities. And I think it'll be interesting to find out if everyone's interested in their own little colonization of the the internal wars or the holy wars, of where they're trying to make their mark, or if people actually interested in bonding together, because it seems like there's more in common than there is differences. But again, I think when people are interested in the colonization piece of it, they're not maybe looking for the let's all join together and fight this fight together. It's more of, no, I'm going my way, I'm going to find gold first, and you go your way and you can find gold first. And I think Brent's article, his most recent one about the consensus piece, what I really liked was, hey, let's all get together on this and see if we have similar paths, because at least from my perspective, that's the most interesting piece.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's the hardest. What to me is the most obvious challenge right now on the left is solidarity and coalition building, and just the larger question too, in terms of the larger context, and we could call it a meta context. Speaking of sense-making communities, that's a very popular term, but the larger context of this climate crisis is, as what I think like Jordan Hall and those folks are talking about in their own language. They're talking about like systems change, and Game B is like this whole other civilizational code or operating system. There's a lot of metaphors along those lines, but I do think, like, whether or not we agree with those metaphors or we feel they're too abstract and they're not really kind of on the ground enough with what's going on in terms of speaking directly about race, etc. Regardless, I think the question is that large? Like, what do we do facing the climate crisis? Like, our whole project of globalization and neoliberal capitalism is incompatible with planet Earth. So what do we do with that? Speaking of solidarity, we're all together in that issue, right? So I think this is almost too large even to conceive of. It's a civilizational transition that deals with sociology and psychology, anthropology. It's a leap in that true kind of mutational sense that Gene Gebser speaks about. For those of you who aren't familiar, another integral theorist. So yeah, I think we're dealing with a massive issue and a very much an extended crisis right now. And solidarity and coalition building is really important, but we seem to be at each other's throats. And obviously, like, this is certainly a problem on the left. And I think maybe some of the obstacles to some folks in the emergencia or in the intellectual dark web, the rallying cry for them has been to point out these extremisms on the left, going like, look at them tearing down statues of abolitionists, look at them, demanding equal rights in a very authoritarian way, or a very aggressive, violent sort of comply or be canceled sort of way. They kind of, their reaction is just to be turned off by the whole approach. And to Brent's credit, I think he meant this anyway, but one of the things he was saying, which is a helpful attitude, I think the intellectual dark web could use a little more of, is take what the left is doing, even when it's mistaken, on good faith. Like, they are attempting to do something. You may have criticisms of how they're attempting to do it, but let's take what they're doing in good faith and try to work with that. I think that's the starting place, right, for this kind of mediation, this community building. And then within the left as well, because we got the DSA canceling like Adolf Reed because they're calling him a class reductionist, right? So, there are plenty of stories that are like less than inspiring in terms of that coalition building we certainly need to work on. But I think you're right, Matt, that like that is definitely one of the central concerns that's on my mind right now. And just to like throw another topic in the ring here, like, Crystal Ball and Segal Rangetti from The Hill, like we were championing those guys during the whole Bernie campaign, and now they're really kind of being critiqued for being, well, Crystal's being critiqued for being complicit, and then Segar is just being straight up kind of thrown out as a fascist and neo-reactionary, etc. So I think creating mediational spaces seems to be extremely difficult in a hyperpolarized environment, right? Because like any kind of mediational work is looked down upon, and any kind of mistake, and there will be mistakes. Maybe Crystal should have been harder on Segar over this time period. Maybe not, I don't know. Are looked upon without much patience. So we're dealing with a lot of perspectival problems, like Gebser talks about, in terms of polarization and fragmentation. And yeah, I don't know if I have easy, direct answers to that either, because it seems like it's not just on the left and the right, it's just like all across the board in our cultural phenomenology. And that may in itself be a symptom that the whole thing is going through, I don't know, a phasing out process, right? And then what do you do with that? Like, okay, our main platforms are all fragmented. Everyone's fighting each other. Everything is toxic. We can kind of sympathize for the folks who want to disconnect from everything and not get involved in politics and just want to go into game B and say, forget about the left and the right. Let's build a new civilization. I get where they're coming from about it, but I feel like as people who represent some next phase of evolution or whatever we're calling ourselves, like we have to do better than just react, right? Like that seems like such a natural human reactive stance to go, it's too much, I don't want anything to do with it. Well, okay, but like you're an integralist, right? You're a game B guy. Like you should be able, this should be the work, right? Anyway, I'm just ranting, but like that's sort of where I feel these frustrations.
All right. Go ahead, Ryan.
Oh, no, go ahead, Matt. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I think this is where Wilbur's critique of IDW and metamodern should at least be bookmarked in that they don't bring up ultimate truth, right? So if there's no liberation or enlightenment perspective of inner consciousness and how that might reflect to global consciousness, I think it's important to bring up, like, it seems like, at least when I listen to those communities, Wilbur's critique is accurate. And Ryan, I'm definitely interested to see what your take on this is, because there's no real recollection of, or even spotlight on the own individual transformation that possibly needs to happen, right? So if everyone's looking at, as far as what does the world need to change, we're missing the key piece of maybe even what we need to go through personally to bring our level of consciousness to that next sort of level, rather than just assume everyone just happens to be there already because this is being talked about. And I think that assumption should not just be a pre-given. I think each kind of voice that wants to sort of speak on these issues has to, at least from what I'm looking at it, look at, okay, well, you know, is this person also coming from a place of, you know, post-conventional thinking, post-conventional morality, or perhaps, you know, are they coming at it from a lower moral perspective? Go ahead, Ryan.
I think there's some of that going on. Mostly what I've seen as being popular, you know, contemplative or spiritual practices has been in terms of like collective insight, cultural building kind of things, you know, like circling or I don't know exactly what Bonita Roy does, but something like that, right? You know, like on the Stoa, there's a lot of like psychotechnology playground and breaking the frame and different people are interested in the internal part. My frustration, kind of building off of Jeremy's critique, is the apoliticalness of it. And you know, Brent talks about how all of these things are apolitical, and my bar is even lower than Brent. Like, I just want some conscious discussion about politics and policy. And let me just share how I kind of see it from the perspective of my life and where I am now. Right, I have like a pretty good life. Like, I'm like pretty set with like my house and my relationship and my animals and my finances. So my next question is, well, I'm already living a game B lifestyle. I have a permaculture farm outside. I have a bunch of animals. I have 5 acres. I live right next to the Columbia River Gorge, and I have a great life. Okay, what can I do to help other people who do not have as good a life as me? That's the question I wake up asking myself. And I think that redesigning a civilization based on anti-rivalrous dynamics, I mean, that sounds awesome. That ain't gonna happen for a while, right? What can I do to help other people in my community? And how can that scale to any kind of meaningful level? And to me, that's where politics comes in, and supporting policies that help the most people, especially at a time like this, right? universal healthcare, UBI, whatever, Green New Deal, and the wars, stop the drug wars, police reform. These are a lot of tangible things that we can converge behind, that we can rally behind and try to make some kind of practical change. And I like the idea of revolutionary reform that Andre Gors talks about, that I learned from Michelle Bowen's book. It's like you can have policies that are transformative for the whole system while also working within the current system. So you don't have to, it's not necessarily a quantum leap to something completely different. You can start in helping people right now, and then in doing so, that creates the positive conditions for a completely new system to emerge out of that. But I don't like this, the bypassing to me is a little bit too much. And I think that there are ways we can make bridges in this liminal zone that we're in now. And of course, my perspective as a left-leaning integralist is that the leftist policies that have been circulating in the discourse right now that would especially be helpful for a time like this are good revolutionary reforms or transitional policies. They may not be, they're not the end all be all, right? They're to help ferry us through this difficult time. And then if we want to get to deeper reforms, right, really rethinking everything and restructuring civilization on completely different grounds, then we can start having that conversation. But until people are dying and struggling and not having healthcare and not having any income, and their businesses have gone out of business, and a whole bunch of them are not coming back, and we have unemployment level of, or Great Depression level of unemployment and lines outside of food banks, like that's not acceptable to me. So that's kind of where I am now, is let's fight for these things right now and also concurrently work towards a complete paradigm transformation. But one without the other to me is incomplete.
Yeah, I think also with that, Ryan, because I think you froze, or there you are. But I think also what I come against is the limits of that, right? So we could all, I mean, I think we've just been discussing politics now for a few months, and I think for the most part we're on the same page, but we're limited as far as how much we can transform that. I think, at least when I reflect on my own life as far as what I can do to kind of talk about those needs the same way, Ryan, is to simply use, like we're doing on this forum, to simply be an activist to some degree in the sense of talking about it. But I also realize I can come up with my own conclusion and have it make sense in my head, but it's also, I hit the limits as far as what I can actually overtly do in sort of in the policies in the government, right? So, I mean, just sometimes being, I think there's, I just got done with the subtle activism book, and I think there's ways you can still be a subtle activist while you can be accused of sort of bypassing these things. I also think just by holding them internally, you could at least, and again, this is the debatable part of it, is you can make some sort of strides in the larger universe if you come from that perspective on it, in my opinion.
Can you just give a quick summary of the Subtle Activist book? Like what is
Yeah,
that
I mean,
about?
basically, here's one sort of grandiose sort of statement from this, and a lot of it, and I am in communication with Mr. Nicole to try to kind of come on our show and kind of talked about it. But he talked about how, I think during World War II, was it Aurobindo that was he the Pondicherry guy? Yeah, so he talked about, he kind of, according to him in his autobiography or whatever, that he did some sort of meditative subtle activism to change the tide of World War II, right? So you can sort of see this guy in India just sort of somehow backing the Allies and defeating the Nazis. And as much as when I read that, I was like, oh, wow, that's so out there, and like, come on, really? But I mean, at least from my perspective, at least when I reflect on my own life and you think about the limits that we're up against, I mean, are we making any sort of grand action when we're, thinking about Donald Trump in our head and, using our subtle body? Are we somehow changing the tide of world history? I mean, I know that sounds very extreme, and most people that come from a sort of scientific perspective would go, you're just crazy woo-woo fairy new age stuff. And that's I can see that perspective, but I also think if you're going to take the integral kind of point of view and you try to understand maybe the bigger picture of reality and kind of what we're dealing with, I don't think that dismisses you to say you shouldn't be involved politically, but it's certainly, I think most people would say, well, most of the power comes from when you're being an overt activist, when you're actually out there, protesting, hitting the streets, doing that kind of stuff. And most people would dismiss the subtle activism. Oh, you're just sitting in your house and spiritually bypassing all of this. I would like to at least throw my hat in the ring and say, well, maybe the spiritual activists are doing more than the other critics are, accusing them of. Maybe there's a little bit more to this than we're not taking in perspective. But that's just my angle, Ryan. I'm not sure if you agree or disagree, because there's also that perspective too, is maybe we should be doing more. But sometimes I know when I look at my own life, I know there's limits out there as far as how much influence I can actually do with everyone else that's involved in this world.
Yeah, I just want to mention that we are getting some comments in the live stream chat. It's David Nickel. Somebody's asking who the author is that you mentioned, Matt. I'm gonna type it in the chat. Yes, yeah, and then as Matt Segal is actually in the stream. Matt should jump on the call with us sometime. We got to do this again. As for subtle activism, if it means meditating on world peace while voting for neoliberals, it's actually just a net loss. Yeah. Well, yeah, I think, like what Ryan was saying, right? Like there's a certain literacy that we have to have to simply enact and talk about certain policies, right? Like the bare minimum is supporting the Green New Deal, supporting someone who's not a neoliberal, advocating a new kind of economic and social value that translates into voting. Like that's a really simple thing we should be able to do as a society, right? Like just showing up to the ballot and voting for our local elections. That's not too extreme, and yet it seems like there's so much obstruction against even just doing that these days. But I think, again, like at the very least, like this is our foundation. Like Ryan was saying before, this is like where we begin, just having a consideration for people who are suffering right now. I mentioned this in my live stream a day or so ago, before, just talking about like, well, where do we begin? It's like, well, just a simple ethical position of people are suffering in the moment. Like, let's say the building or the city is falling apart, and then there are people standing around going like, well, systemically, there's a lot of trouble with this, and I don't really want to get involved. I mean, the whole city is going to be ruined anyway. But meanwhile, there are people who are suffering, right? Who need help, who need water, who need to be pulled out of a burning district in the city. And what do you do? Like, well, you try to help out as best you can. You don't think about it in terms of you saving the whole city for for yourself, but you try to do what you can, right? So I really feel like it's kind of, I don't know, we could even take a Christian perspective on it, as they say, like being in the world but not of the world. You can be in game A but not of game A. You could be a game B person, trying to enact that culture, and then also helping who you can, right? I think it's some really simple, not abstract orientations that we need. Like, it's not even overcomplicated. It's like, just be there to help people as an orientation, and realize that, yeah, systemically, a lot of things are stacked up against us, but we could at least, as a bare minimum, participate in our ability in a democracy to vote appropriately, at least, right? Advocate for it, at least in our social spheres. I don't know. I don't feel like that should be so difficult, and yet it's been kind of a constant debate in our circles and communities for being too green or something, or too leftist.
Yeah, and just to speak on that guy, yeah, it might be a net loss if I was to vote for neoliberals, but part of it is also to balance out both the left quadrants and the right quadrant. So I mean, my vote will cancel out with the Republican in some regards if we're voting for like a governor or something like that. But to me, it's also about, we are trying to make sense. What are the best policies out there? What a term that I'm coming across, at least in my head, is there has to be a political middle path to all of this. And I agree that the extremism on both sides just doesn't work. That doesn't mean a centrist position, but I think it's also like, if we're all advocating for the Green New Deal, I think it's also worth looking into, like, knowing, okay, what does that even mean? I know before we had Andres Bernal on, I was even unaware that a Green New Deal had a jobs guarantee in it. So I think for the left to also be informed, I think Ben Burgess brought this up in his book, you have to have and Ryan just brought it up, you have to be able to debate those people around the water cooler that just dismiss Green New Deal as this fairy tale sort of policy. Well, if you understand MMT, you just gained another notch in sort of defending why the Green New Deal could work. And you're educating other citizens. So you can't dismiss your sort of own inner circle that you can affect. And hopefully enough sort of people come together, then you start changing the debate. And I think it's being balanced in both sides, and being able to see how much can you affect. And I think the middle path is usually the best option, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and say that I was watching John Vervaeke talk about Buddhism and the middle path in his Meaning Crisis lecture series, and what he said really well is that the middle path, to make a political analogy, right? The middle path is not like centrism. It's not the center point between 2 points. It's actually a transcendental thing that is in a different level than the original polarity, right? I think to kind of oscillate to the other side and jump to the big picture thing, this is why I think Gebser is so helpful to study. And what I want to throw to Jeremy next is, do you think it would be helpful to try to plug Gebser or to try to encourage people to study Gebser who are in these circles? And why I found Gebser so illuminating is because his articulation of the pervasiveness, the ubiquity of the perspectival mental world, and how much that kind of thinking, the linear, forward-looking, abstracting, consciousness or mentality, how that infiltrates and influences everything, right? And he does, and it's such a deeply entrenched structure and such a deeply ossified part of our experience, as we're all products of that world, that we're not aware of it, right? It's very McLuhan, right? We're not aware of the technologies or the effects of the mental that we're always swimming in all the time. We're not aware that we're wet. And if you don't understand the full extent of that, the solution, your prescriptive answers for these problems could very easily just be recapitulating the mental. You could just be further doubling down on the problem and reinforcing the origin of the problem, which is that the mental perspectival world has kind of, what's the word, outlived its time, basically, and it's collapsing. It's kind of imploding in on itself with all of this hyper fragmentation, hyper polarization, hyper everything, hyper normal stimuli, and unless we really understand the extent of it, this is kind of my biggest critique or disagreement with a lot of IDW characters too, is a lot of their solutions are very reactionary in that they're just doubling down on the mental and not focusing on or not promoting solutions that are more integral in nature, which is what we need to move into. And so that's something I think would be really helpful for people if you want to redesign civilization, right? And I've been thinking about a lot of the foundations of our modern civilization and foundational concepts that were born in the Enlightenment that we take for granted or we don't even think about anymore because they're such a part of our world. And I've been really trying to question them. And one example is that Trevor Noah, after George Floyd was killed, he did a piece on like rethinking social contracts, and that got a lot of views. And I was like, yeah, the social contract is very, very foundational to this Western modernist tradition, right? Like Hobbes and Locke and Kant and Rousseau, and granting legitimacy and authority to the sovereign, to the government, through ostensibly people, agreeing to surrender some of their freedoms to gain more net positive freedoms by having a government agency protect your rights. Things like private property, right? John Locke and how influential that was in the founding of America, right? Thomas Jefferson, the classic liberal tradition. Thinking about Montesquieu and the separation of powers and dividing the government between judicial and legislative and executive branches, right? Adam Smith, division of labor. I could go on and on about all these things that we take for granted. and really say like, I wonder if all of these ideas need a kind of critical re-examining from integral lens. And if we're going to build a civilization that's completely different, based on anti-rivalrous dynamics, or based on sustainable, regenerative economy and culture, or whatever, I think it's really helpful to study Gebser and try to align those things with the integral criteria, so you're not accidentally just remaking more mental, which is what we need to get away from. I don't know, Jeremy, you have any thoughts on that?
Amen. I think that's absolutely critical. The reason, or one of the things that's been coming up in my class, we're having our final session tomorrow, just sort of a concluding session, is defixation on mental consciousness, like really training ourselves to become not only intellectually and conceptually aware, but like phenomenologically aware, right? Like how it is arising in us, in our culture, in our thought patterns, in our perception patterns, experientially. That work is really difficult. And it actually, one of the reactions I think you've seen in the class, because you've been participating, is a lot of students feel like it's overwhelming. The Perspectival is everywhere. It's like, it's our entire code, it's the matrix, basically. Like, what do we do to really break out of that? What can we really do? But I think the dislodging that fissure, or that sudden disjointedness of suddenly feeling like everything really is like way too perspectival in its orientation is I think a tremendously radical act, in that sense of like Gebserian sense of being originary, right? That we suddenly begin to see through how we are culturally enacting perspectivalism, and we're no longer comfortable with engendering that any further in any kind of domineering way. So yeah, I think everything from the way in which we've organized our government in terms of its structures and legal systems and different checks and balances, social contracts. I mean, this riffs right into McLuhan as well. Like, okay, we have a print culture civilization. We have a print culture state. The state is a print culture expression. It's the medium and it's the message, right? The print, the word, the text, the state as this homogenous thing. Whatever's happening after this, or whatever's emerging out of this, is not going to be the homogenous nation state with its legalistic contracts. Like, there is going to be something different. So I think it is radically transformative, and I think that's also why it's so hard to think outside of it, right? Maybe we're not. And here's the cryptic response to this. Like, I'm kind of sharing Matt Segal's I don't know if it's cynicism. I don't know if it's fair to say that, Matt, because I don't consider you cynical. But there is a kind of a frustration with the world right now, to put it lightly, with the way things are going. But I think if COVID taught us anything, if this pandemic is revealing us anything, it's that as that structure begins to collapse, there is more room for innovative thinking. More people actually start to get shaken out of the sleepwalking, right? Like McLuhan says, there's no more lolling about in the unconscious of a media ecology. People can wake up in a crisis. I'm not saying the crisis is salvific. I'm just saying that, like, there seems to be a lot more discussion about post-capitalist futures right now during this pandemic. It hasn't taken hold in any kind of substantive way in terms of the institutions of power, but maybe we should continue to expect that to be the case. And I don't know, like, do we just follow lines of flight at this point? And like, okay, where are the new directions, new conversations going? Who is innovating, right? And how can we bolster and embody and practice that in little ways? I want to bring up one thing that Brent Stickley mentioned here in the chat. And he says, to this point, he says, if we look at Sri Aurobindo as Debashish Banerjee does, Aurobindian scholar from CIS, regarding self-fashioning in a Foucauldian sense and translating that into transpersonal terms, we have to have that direct, actionable as a practice. So I think that's a really good way to think about, at the bare minimum, like voting not for neoliberals, right? Voting for democratic progressives, participating in maybe some of the protests if we're able to, right? Like, this is yoga. This is actually our practice, right? This is our meditation. This is how we enact that integrality. So I think reading it that way is like, oh, okay, well, like, just as, cleaning let's say like the monastic life, right? Everything becomes an invitation to be in a state of prayer or contemplation, a state of service. So what can be our yoga? I think we can kind of see it that way in terms of like, yeah, bare minimum, vote for people who support the Green New Deal. Yes, it's a middle path, but this is how you enact your yoga or your integral reality in the world. So there's that. And then I think an intensification of that is supporting the more interesting projects like you're talking about MMT. We can go one step even beyond that and talk about like Joe Brewer's work with regenerative culture practices. Like he just hosted a webinar earlier today about how to regrow an entire bioregion. So he's talking about South America and Central America. He's situated in Costa Rica. And as a small project, they're trying to regenerate, I think, a valley that's seen a lot of like ecological devastation from farming, et cetera. So there are ways I think we can perceive that as a kind of practice, as a kind of spiritual practice, like Matt was saying about sacred activism. And I think that's a start. I mean, I think some of this is like just reframing, but I think you're right, Matt, Ryan, in terms of like coherence, reading folks like Gebser and anyone who's tangentially related to Gebser as just like, that's a foundation, right? Like that clears your palette. That really clears the palette if you read him appropriately, to help cohere where your yoga should be, where your practice should be in the world, right? And actually give that more energy. So yes, I think there's a coherence with all these things.
And I haven't gotten through EPO yet, but I know I'm at the part where they're talking about, just at the part here, the chapter of where the forms of manifestation and the efficient forms and the deficient forms. So I think, when we're talking about perspective, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Jeremy, he talks about the menos and the ratio being the efficient and deficient forms of the mental. I mean, at least how I'm taking, all perspectives aren't bad, right? You can transcend past that, but there are, like you were saying, right, there's a lot of good, the transcend and include of the enlightenment, of that phase of the modern age, of the postmodern age. Everything presented a baby. So it's very important as Integral is trying to come out of this. What is the baby that we're supposed to be nurturing and making sure that it grows? And what's the bathwater that we're making sure it drains? And so to be very aware of that and mindful of that. You talked about it well, Jeremy, with the yoga of that. I think it's very important. I know for me, with these communities, these intentional communities we're trying to form, we're all trying to make sense together. Everyone comes from a different perspective. And I think the value of that is, trying to integrate all these different ideas and find out what is, like Brent was saying, what is the consensus? What can we say is the baby out of this? This is what we want to keep. This is what we want to nurture, and make sure it is coherent, and that you're bringing all the quadrants in, and you're respecting them, and something new is going to form once you integrate, the transcendental ideals. Something powerful is going to come that wasn't there before. And I think part of our job is to make sure that we're aware of what those things are and continue to integrate them together.
Go ahead, Jeremy.
Oh no, go ahead, Ryan. Ryan, it's fine.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say that what I appreciate about Brent's consensus building and his emphasis on convergence is it adds this dynamic quality or energy or even direction to these movements. And I feel sometimes this energy or feeling of it's like kind of like in these emergencia communities, there's a kind of like wateriness. like what are we doing here, guys? Like, and of course I always end up feeling kind of unproductive in sense where it's like I'm like pretty happy with my life, right? So if I'm like working on meditating or doing these groups and exploring mimetic mediation stuff, and it doesn't feel quite dynamic enough for me. Like, where's the real change that we're mustering, right? What are we really galvanizing behind? What is really lighting our fires, that if we can all put our heads together, we can be force multipliers for each other and really launch something powerful to change the culture and to change the planet. And I think there's a lot of emphasis on collaboration of individual projects or sharing of resources and ideas, like in Game B, for example, right? I'm working on anti-rivalrous car repair shop, or I have a permaculture in my back, operation in my backyard or whatever. But where's like the convergence for large scale change, which really requires convergence and consensus as a kind of power play to overcome these entrenched, ossified. Unfortunately, like, the world is run by a lot of not so good people with not so good intentions. And when I listen to Daniel Schmachtenberger talk about redesigning civilization, I feel so inspired. Like, oh, this is awesome. As I see what the Trump administration is doing, I see what Vladimir Putin is doing, I see what Bolsonaro is doing, I see what Xi Jinping is doing, and I'm just like, how are we going to touch those guys? Like, unless we organize locally and pull a Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on a mass level, and try to primary out the corporate Democrats and have some kind of solidarity movement that can really act as a, what's a good word for this? A unified power movement that can really just overpower, these really ossified structural forces and corporate interests that we're up against. I don't see how any of this change can land in reality, or at least not anytime soon, right? And that to me is more exciting and more dynamic. As much as I love just talking to people and having sense-making sessions, it's kind of like, what are we doing here, guys? Like, at a certain point, let's go and really do something tangible.
Yeah, and that is more to the point that I think as a practice, as a kind of yoga, getting our hands a little dirty in the present, in the imminent, with what's going on the ground, it should be where the work starts. It's the hardest place, like we talked about before. It's like the hardest place to really see how getting involved in the trenches of partisan debates and standing for the Green New Deal and standing in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter protests and the new left, et cetera, just like really kind of going, okay, I'm with these guys. It's hard, I think, at the surface to see how that is somehow integral or transpartisan, or even just the game B, right? Like this isn't the new civilization, but that's where it begins. Like, you don't bypass it, and it's not linear. It's not like we need to start here and build stage by stage in that sense necessarily either, but it's where we have to begin. Otherwise, we're just sort of insulating from the world and holding out like a monastic cloister, hoping that once this collapses, we can move in, right? I think there's a role for that monastic space. Like, I really like what Daniel Thorson is doing and what he's popularized with the Vermont monastic community there. But even they are sort of oriented towards like, this is an incubator. We want to apply things in the world. We want to apply sense making in the world, et cetera. So even they are involved. They're more like friars than monks per se, because the friars are like the monastic, the priestly order that kind of goes out in the world and helps out and feeds people, et cetera. So in some way, the friar is a good model here. But I think just getting involved is really where it just begins. I don't know what else we can really say, but I'm frustrated like you in that, Ryan, in that I don't see enough just willingness to do that. I don't want to overthink it. I really see this as sort of the inclination of our community to remain in heady abstract space and not actually touch what's happening. And what happens if we do? It's a simple act. I think our podcast is trying to do that, and Brent is trying to do that, and a number of others who are attempting it in their own way. So I think showing up to our spaces and doing that is another way we can practice this too. But I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I want to address, I think I'm not sure if it's Thomas Hetty or Hetty Thomas, but he asked how do you define an intentional community? And I think for me, a big part of that, and you were hitting on, is the practice, right? And so to me, there's nothing small with trying to just affect at a personal, to me, you start with the personal stuff. What changes are we trying to make in our own personal lives? And then you go to the next circle and you go, well, how much are you affecting the family component of your life? And then you're trying to take it to the social. And so an intentional community is trying to, I see our Discord group as an intentional community. And even in that Discord group, there's a practice channel in the sense we're trying to be vulnerable and expose what are the things that we're working on. So I mean, to me, there's no small limit of change that you can make on a personal level that can affect sort of this larger level. And I think sometimes when I'm even in the integral community, I think there should be more of a practice aspect of it, in the sense of what are we dealing with in our own lives. We're not all perfect. We have our own issues that we're trying to continue to grow ourselves, right? And so I think it's important to look at, you know, what changes can we make, and can we be vulnerable with others? Are we willing to fail in the community and find out how we grow? I think the deliberately developmental organizations are another angle of that, of trying to integrate the internal and the external. So I think the more we can form communities like that, set intentions, to me, and engage in that practice, at least for me, that's what an intentional community is. You're collaborating with others that share similar points of view, that are willing to support you on whatever journey we're on. And then personally, you have to be able to be vulnerable with your own issues to put them out in a group and decide, you know, how is it that we are trying to go personally, grow personally, and then how also can we do that in the community and the political realm as well.
Can I, Ryan?
No, go ahead,
after
Jim.
you,
Go ahead.
I want to posit a definition of mediation. Someone in the comments was saying mediation is important. Obviously, Ryan, you agree. I was tagged in a thread. It was a letter from Don Beck to, I guess, the integral and the spiral dynamics community from 2018. And I'm not going to read the whole letter. I'm just going to give a brief overview of it and my response to it, which was this pitch for reframing the sense of the mediator in the integral context. And so basically he's kind of talking about hyperpolarization and fragmentation in politics as this sort of issue. Like there's this lack of what he calls a superordinate goal, which is if we don't get together, I don't know if you guys are familiar with this already. I don't know Don Beck too well, but he defines a superordinate goal as this, look, if we don't organize and find some sense of agreement beyond our polarization, then things are going to get worse for everybody. We don't want that to happen. A sort of a negative superordinate goal. A positive would be peace or conflict resolution for our people, to not be in this fight anymore. So you want that and you want that. Both sides want that. Good. Let's move towards it. And he says without that, and he says we don't really have that in the United States anymore. We have a lot of trouble. And then interestingly, he brings this up in 2018. He also says that he doesn't call this another polarized dimension, but I think implicitly it is. He says the youth are the best potential for creating the superordinate goal, but they're shut down by the left and the right. So the youth, everybody on all ends of polarization are shut down from actually moving towards these goals. But for me, like this is goes back to the conversation we were all talking about during Bernie's campaign, which was that the bifurcation between the 60+ generation and the younger generations, millennials, et cetera, has been so polarized, right? Like we've never seen this kind of polarization before. Like usually some kind of mediational action can take place where the younger generation has a tide change of attitudes and some of it gets implemented in politics, et cetera. And what we're seeing today is like a very strong reticence from actually doing that. The majority of our generation already has a superordinate goal. Like if we all voted, Bernie would be the candidate for this fall, right? So the Green New Deal would be a much more viable political project. It would be way more on the table than it is right now in terms of actually being enacted. So my response to back in this sort of hypothetical is, well, I'll just read what I said just in terms of this context. Like, all right, so the superordinate goal of the emergent generation is already clear. There's a Green New Deal. There's the aligning of intersectional politics with class revival. like class consciousness revival, sort of the old left and the new left, new left, the aligning of the failure of institutions to yield to this new generation's demands, many of which are not radical to the young generation, but already a new center, reflects the deep consolidation and resistance of neoliberal power across both the left and the right. And I didn't add this, but I was thinking that this is sort of further proof of Latour's thesis that neoliberalism is very aware of all this stuff and is just like in bad faith, resisting everything. But then I continue, what can the new left, let alone an integral left, do in the face of this utter resistance to face the much needed systemic transformation? As Latour suggests, our civilization's core telos, this globalization project, moved by the engine of late capitalism and on which the global, local, left-right polarizations have been traditionally situated, is over. Stated more clearly, it's incompatible with the planet. That's the bad news. The good news, there's still plenty an integral left or really any integralist can be doing. Rather than being mediators between the left and the right, we find ourselves as midwives and mediators between a new fulcrum, the culture that is going through this death process, neoliberal capitalism and globalization, and the planetary culture that needs to be realized, a post-capitalist future, a common-centric society, planetization, whatever we want to call it. The middle is still necessary, but it has a different locus, a different fulcrum. We need to help each other transition to a more ecocentric and regenerative culture. We need to help human societies transition out of collapse and into emergence. Capitalist realism yields to a kind of Gaian realism, one that the virus was a reminder of. For the integralist, that is the superordinate goal, removing in a sidereal way. And this is a Gebserian mutation or a leap into a new orientation. And that's my response. But I kind of see the mediational role, regardless of whether we're getting in the trenches in the debates online about partisan politics, like that's our superordinate goal, right? As a mediator, as a middle way, like that's what we're really trying to work for. Like, so I don't know. What do you guys think?
Can I share an excerpt here from the Subtle Activism book?
Sure.
So this is on the emergence of planetary consciousness. These crisis periods are called bifurcation points, moments of truth when a system can either adapt or perish. Chaos theory informs us that when a system approaches a bifurcation point, it becomes highly sensitive to input. Tiny influences can have vastly amplified effects due to the presence of complex feedback loops. Chaos theorists Briggs and Pete explain, a bifurcation in a system is a vital instant when something is a small single photon of energy, a slight fluctuation in external temperature, a change in destiny, or the flapping of a butterfly's wings in Hong Kong is swelled by iteration to a size so great that a fork is created and the system takes off in a new direction. Russell and Bach argue that the human society confronted by a looming global crisis of many dimensions increasingly resembles a dissipative structure facing a bifurcation point. As these authors acknowledge, civilizational collapse is certainly conceivable, yet chaos theory suggests another possibility, that human society in the right circumstances might rapidly reorganize into a fundamentally new form. The question is, what might induce such a shift? And I think that just kind of speaks to, and his advocacy, I guess, is really, again, kind of doubling down on the spiritual aspect of it, the subtle activism piece of it, that I know I really kind of resonate towards and stuff.
Yeah, totally. I've been thinking about the pandemic as a kind of weird variation on Bruno Latour's Down to Earth, where instead of the environment that we need to start orienting towards, right, instead of the shared Gaian reality that we all inhabit, it's our own physical bodies that are at risk, that are vulnerable here. And there's a reorientation towards the organic and the biological. And now I think the whole debate that Stephanie was saying she has interest in between lives versus livelihoods, shutting down the economy, and again it's another Bruno Latour moment of that gap, right, that pernicious gap between our abstract economic system of capitalism versus our direct, our frail biological human organisms. And because the human body is something that's so immediate that we can relate to, our own health is at stake, maybe that can extend towards a more of an ecological concern, right? That can extend to the biological other in the ecosphere. And just having this reorientation, I was thinking about how Marx was saying that the revolution has to come once capitalism kind of organically collapses. Right? I was watching a ContraPoints video on the problems with capitalism last night, and I was thinking about this. I'm like, well, what a perfect opportunity with the pandemic and everything going on, and how we can really maximize this liminal time with liminal politics, with liminal policies, and liminal cultures, right? That we're trying to build here. And I'm just going to go back again to the what I was saying at the beginning, that we really need to have better sense making around several issues, I think. And I think one of them needs to definitely be race. And I think that also relates a lot to the body, and about with the case of George Floyd, like, here's someone who's being killed and suffocated, and it's recorded on camera. And I think the visceral imprint of that is very strong. And to really understand the different lived experiences of different ethnicities. And again, I'm really a fan of David Hartful's wisdom in this area. It is actually a form of embodying into the social realm, when you can really take the perspective of another lived experience complex that was formed by society and the system, that there is a kind of embodiment that takes place there, right? It's not only a theoretical, abstract kind of perspective taking. It is an embodied perspective taking of people who have been, socialized or racialized or whatever in different ways. And I think what's so helpful about David Hartful's model, which is why I'd love for him to get on, Rebel Wisdom and all these into all these communities, is that ironically, like, if you put ethnicity in a kind of developmental framework, which he's doing with the negrescence theory, there you can get a kind of an idea of the end goal of why we're bothering with all this social justice, racial stuff at all. It's not just like for example, if there are in different communities, there might be like race specific groups, right? Like where my girlfriend works at a nonprofit in Portland, they have like a white people's learning space. And so at first glance, it looks like segregation. And people are, get really horrified that this is happening in some of the more extreme social justice circles, right? But when you put it into the context of David Hartful's model, that's just a phase that people go through. That's not the end goal, right? It's a phase in people's ethnic development. And then you can see where people are in their process of understanding ethnicity, and then kind of nudge them in a direction where you can arrive at what's essentially a more integral understanding of ethnicity and how ethnicity influences our worldview and values and so forth, right? And I like what he said at the end of his video on YouTube. He said, every ethnicity has strengths and blind spots, and it's important to know generally where your blind spots are. And it's such an innocuous ask. It doesn't have any like maliciousness or vindictiveness attached to it. And I think that these kind of simple reframes need to be injected into these sense-making communities, and our thinking about these issues needs to mature, right? And I think this is all tied down to a sense of embodiment and a sense of how to connect what could be an insulated culture with the rest of society, and build these bridges and help to kind of pave the way for a much more mature, nuanced, integrated understanding of such inflammatory and divisive topics.
Well said, Ryan. I feel like that was like a I don't know, like a mini talk right there, just like the way you concluded it.
Thank you. It's been brewing in me for a long time. I'm happy to get it out.
Yeah. No, that's great. I think we got to have David Hartful on again soon as well. I think this is just as a synergistic note. This format of live streaming is really fun because we have more of a community engagement. I like that there's more conversation going on around our conversation, and we can kind of jump in there a little bit. So, I really like what you guys did with Stephanie Lapp while I was away. That was nice, and Brent as well. So I don't know, just kind of having a rotating community of conversations where we can live stream this, I think would be fantastic. But at any rate, I have a whole thing, but I want to wait. Maybe Matt, if you want to jump in first. and then I'll jump in.
Well, I just had a real quick thought on Ryan's take. I know I liked Luana's take on, I asked in the Discord group if race was a type, and I liked her response. Basically, I just wanted to see if you agree with what she was saying, that basically race is a social construct. Would you agree with that, Ryan?
I'm not aware of the context of your the discussion, but I think the way that I think about, okay, so this is a confusion that I see happening a lot. I actually had a talk with my friend about this the other day. In integral, in the quadrant terms, right? A lot of people mistake talk of race as upper right quadrant instead of lower left quadrant. So a lot of the, like propertarians or alt-right or the racial realists, right? Those guys are also talking about racial differences, but they're talking about ostensibly biological differences, like race and IQ, or like when Stefan Molyneux goes on Dave Rubin and said something like, well, a 25-year-old white person's brain is bigger than a 25-year-old black person's brain, right? That's like getting into like some racist eugenics kind of stuff really quickly. The left perspective on race is, at least what I am interested in, right, is the socially influenced or constructed aspects of race and ethnicity as different groups are racialized in society that's not colorblind. And then you have to advocate for those perspectives that are not being seen by other groups. Like, for example, and just to kind of give a reverse example that I was joking about with someone, people on one of the mimetic mediator calls in the Stoa were talking about how, because they're white, they're really afraid of saying something inappropriate or being canceled, right? So white people are feeling more and more muzzled and unable to speak out on racial issues. And I was thinking about that for myself, and I'm like, huh, I can see that. I can feel some of the brooding, the anxiety that white people tend to feel these days. But that's not a perspective that was native to me, because I'm not white, and I don't get that kind of treatment or blowback as much, right? I mean, Asians kind of occupy a weird space in the culture war, but it's not a perspective that's natural to me. So in that sense, the experience of being a certain ethnicity is different, and that's what I'm trying to get people to understand, right? I don't give a shit about biological differences or if there's any real. I mean, most people would say that there's the biological differences are so small, it's not even worth talking about. And so, yeah, it's the socially constructed aspect of race and those perspectives that are constructed from it that I'm interested in illuminating, and that does require kind of sociological or even postmodern awareness to really grok at a deep level,
Or even anthropological, right? Like just symbolic. Like, again, we're talking about these are social, so therefore they're symbolic, they're meaning-making differences. They have to do with different ethnicities, languages, histories, right? Mythologies, religious contexts. So there's so many different variables that go into that social production of race that need to be looked at and not just dismissed for not being rational or not being really like scientifically like we need the soft sciences, we need the anthropology and the sociology. We can't just dismiss race as being like infinitesimally unimportant at a genetic level, and then only a total social construction that's very postmodern and it doesn't matter. Like, we really need that kind of mediational space of sociology and the humanities to help us kind of get into the subjectivities and the experiences of just, this is the human dimension, right? This is the meaning making dimension. So without a literacy in that, I think you're right that it's difficult to have these conversations. They tend to go like one extreme to the other. And to your point, I think you've mentioned this before, Ryan, as well, that like on the subject of race, so much of the intellectual dark web tends to kind of go with the mental ratio understanding, right? Genetics doesn't really exist, we need to get over it. And they think you're being progressive in the sense of like, well, science shows us that we're all one human family, rationally speaking, scientifically speaking, so let's just go to the science. But there's a kind of, again, perspectival reductionism in that approach. So yeah, I think the intellectual dark web is kind of rife with a mental ratio retrieval, unfortunately. They haven't surpass that either. But yeah, I don't know if you wanted to riff on that at all.
I just wanted to say really quickly, it's what Brent's was talking about. They're asociological, right? They don't understand the lower left quadrant and anthropology and sociology and culture very well. And I think that's a, and you know, Wilbur predicted this culture war back in like the 90s of the evolutionary biologists versus the cultural studies people, right? The upper right quadrant versus the lower left quadrant, and the confusion that happens there. So yeah, I'm always trying to shed light more on the. Of course, I love to say how I'm from a Japanese culture, from a Buddhist temple in Hawaii. I'm from a very different culture than American culture. So to me, the influence of culture and race, I think, was more illuminated than for most people. You know, I'm Jeremy. I'm sure you know you have some interesting takes on it too. But yeah.
Well, here's the other perspective. I think bringing up what Lerner talked about, and I don't think we've posted that one yet, but in his book Revolutionary Love, he also talked about how the left is canceling out if you're white, you know, that you don't really belong on the left. So you know, if you're male, you don't really belong on the left. And so I think there's different ways of kind of making sure you're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater just because it doesn't fit in this small narrative. I think we're trying to make a larger narrative and try to find out what's included and what's excluded.
So Matt, I'm just curious. You know, have you felt that way being part of the left?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's a loose term in the sense of I don't give a shit really if people want me in their party or not. In some regards, you know, I'm going to do what I think is best, regardless if I'm white or male. To me, those are just these labels. But I don't. I was only bringing that up because he's had his skin in the game has been there for a while and has seen this kind of evolved over the years since the 60s and stuff. But I think it's, you know, I like the piece of it being a social construct and just to see kind of where to go with that, you know, what you can deconstruct from that and then reconstruct. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting, you know, to me, I think race can also, and I think someone mentioned this on the chat here, can also split you up further if you jump on your own race and then go in that angle. To me, that I'm not sure that solves too many things.
Yeah, and just for folks, I'm hoping to publish our chat with Lerner either tomorrow or on Monday. And he was a very, very insightful guy. It was mostly a talk by him actually, which was kind of fun. That was a new take for us. We were there to kind of just hold the space for him to present his life, really. You know, as you'll hear, I think his perspectives are really interesting from the fact that he's been doing this for decades. He had a lifetime working through the civil rights movement going forward. So I think what he has to say is deeply valuable, and there's some insight there into actually listening to our elders in terms of, you know, who's went through this in the past cultural cycle of activism. I wanted to get to a couple comments. There's just a couple of good ones in here. Okay, so there's a lot of talk about capitalism because we were talking about getting into post-capitalist futures. There's two from Armando that kind of synergize that we can riff on. He says, what is the importance of futurism for the left in the age of capitalist realism? And then a little bit later on, he mentions some great buzzwords that I like to hear. When we were talking about fixation, right, a defixation from the mental structure of the perspectival world, he's talking about Mark Fisher's acid communism, psychedelic and mystical experiences, critically defamiliarize private perspectival reality. Sure, I think these things all work together and we can kind of explore this, but in terms of the role of futurism, as a way of combating capitalist realism, I think as long as futurism isn't merely enacting, there's an efficient expression of perspectivalism that Gebser talks about. But I think even in Fisher's writing, there's still this sense of like, hey, like modernity had this project of freedom and a better world, and we were marching towards it for decades, and it felt like every decade had all of these different innovations culturally, et cetera, and capitalist realism eventually kind of froze everything into the stasis, right? And that's sort of his part of his thesis about this. It captures all the new, it captures all the revolutionary, it captures even progress itself, so that eventually it kind of becomes this giant, I don't know, Matrix or Borg-like assimilative thing, right? The Thing is another movie that's like a good metaphor for it that I think that he might use actually in his book Capitalist Realism. But in terms of defixation, sure, I think any of those things he listed, like mystical states, anything that kind of crosses this boundary and this border. But that's why I mentioned Gebser, because Gebser's entire work is about experientially and phenomenologically overcoming that perspectival Cartesianism in yourself, right? The foundations of the perspectival capitalist, progress-oriented, direction-oriented world is what needs to be defixated. We can't even go back to an efficient and a healthy form of the perspectival world as the answer to this crisis. And I think that's the harder thing to wrap our minds around. So just I would just add that. And then there's like another comment from Jared, which was really good. And he was asking about, let's see, yeah, he says, wouldn't integral politics transcend and include capitalism? From my point of view, it seems the integral left rejects this outright. Am I wrong? And I'll pause here and we can respond a little bit and percolate this stuff.
I guess for me, what I wrote was that I'm not really sure what post-capitalism looks like. I'm not strong in the economic realm. I'm not sure if it transcends and includes or transcends and replaces. I think when we go into post-capitalism, what I've understood, it's very abstract. The most sort of down-to-earth economic theory that I could see kind of a transition to, or at least an understanding to, a shift, is the MMT perspective. So you see a lot of right now with kind of Bernie was kind of big on this bandwagon, is corporate socialism. You had all this money with no transparency about where this money went to these companies. You had companies that didn't qualify for these loans that applied for it. And so for me, it's really about this economic model of getting away from this upper level tier that the money trickles down to. How can you create sort of this economic system that's able to take in some of these larger issues like the ecological crisis, about job creation. And to me, that's where a shift needs to happen as far as what we're being told by the mainstream media, by our politicians, of having and have the sort of champions of this policy come through. And I know Rob Smith kind of badmouthed a little bit and shared something, and we posted Andres on that. But I think it's worth having a debate on that side of it, because I think when most people think, oh, well, you're just creating this fictional economic system, and I think there's enough weight to go with, the Stephanie Kelton book. I haven't read it yet, the deficit myth, to kind of go into that and try to find out, well, is it a myth, or can you actually kind of, does it make sense? Can you create some of these policies that will actually change sort of the way things were done in the past, and maybe put more money into the pockets, put more money into this global level of thinking. That's my 2 cents. What about you, Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is a a highly debated question and topic, and I think I remember what Edward Burge was saying about transcending and negating certain structures. And I think there are different ways of looking at it, right? How, when we're talking about transcend and include, what does that really mean? What are we trying to include? And in terms of the deeper structures, capitalism is a byproduct. It is a manifestation of the perspectival consciousness, right? So we always include in the integral structure, we always include the mental, rational, perspectival, modernist level of abstraction. It's just not the center of the universe anymore. So when it comes to capitalism, and in terms of the post-capitalist books I've studied, which I'm not an expert in, but I'll just name some of them. I've studied Jeremy Rifkin's stuff. I studied Venus Project and Jacques Fresco's stuff. Who's a Paul Mason has a book on post-capitalism that I'm like halfway through actually right now, and Michelle Bowens' collaborative commons stuff. And I think there's a lot to unpack in terms of like what a I can tell you where to start and why I kind of align with the progressive side of things. Is that the first thing we have to really worry about is the pernicious and totalizing financialization of the economy. And that is really, I think, the most dangerous, most volatile, most unstable, unhealthy manifestation of capitalism. Right. Then there are other questions of capitalism in terms of the ownership structures, right? And if the capitalists, in for a Marxist analysis, right, should the capitalists and the capitalist class, the bourgeois and the owning class and the investing class, the stakeholder class, and their relationship with actual capital, and then where the workers fit into it, and then we talk about what's his name, Wolf, the Marxist professor.
Oh, Richard Wolff. Right?
Richard Wolff, yeah, right, and the democratization of the workplace, and that kind of line of thinking too. And then of course there's the bigger picture of the commons, and also about like Rifkin's zero marginal cost society, and how we have a gap between a for-profit capitalist system and also being able to produce things almost for free. And Paul Mason talks about iTunes songs still being like $1 to buy, right? When you can just listen to like literally any, I just download things on YouTube, and then there's like LibGen, and through the internet and through open sourcing and information exchange, you can have a lot of things for free, but there's still profit motives get inserted into the picture, and that creates incoherence in the whole system, right? And that creates different kinds of problems and instabilities in capitalism. So there's so much to think about, and I don't really know exactly. I don't think anyone knows exactly what it'll look like. But I think that when the fragility of a neoliberalist dominated capitalist system has been so exposed by the pandemic, and I think that pernicious gap between the financial sector and the actual the labor sector is so. I mean, at least in the U.S., it's so disgraceful. It's not like Germany, where half the board of corporations are like the workers, right? Like we don't have that kind of what Robert Wright calls countervailing power with unions and so forth, the United States, as they do in Germany or the Nordic countries or in other European countries. So we got to start somewhere, and then we can allow the collaborative commons, we can allow this kind of open source, transparent economics to emerge. But we have to start with, in my opinion, progressive policies to lay the groundwork for those things to emerge in any kind of healthy way, or at least emerge in a way that's not repressed by the corporate state.
Yeah, I think fundamentally, to your point, Ryan, seeing what's going on in terms of progressive policies, like obviously this is not the post-capitalist future by supporting a stronger labor unions, peer-to-peer networks, et cetera, that are kind of embedded within the financialization of our the totalizing capitalist realism of our civilization, right? It's just, it infects and affects all sectors. So obviously this is a sort of a long haul project, but I think taking a non-utopian view that like, oh, it's not the game B, so let's not get involved is a bad place to begin, because it's so totalizing, right? Like we have to diaphanize or immanentize the future in the sense of like, yeah, I know that progressive policies are not, you know, a common centric post-capitalism, but they're in the same spirit of it, right? Just as we could look at previous turns, historically speaking, in constitutional monarchies as sort of like, well, okay, that's the part of the emergence of the state. There was still a king, right? There was still a kind of monarchy. And in many ways, you know, it didn't really get realized because of the centralization of banks, et cetera, held by the state and held by the previous powers that be. But, you know, there's kind of amphibious gestures for the future, towards the future, that I think we have to participate in, that are important. But in terms of, you know, what that looks like and what kind of direction to go in, like you're saying, is so much of this is contingent on first the capitalist power structure, financial sector to collapse, to no longer be able to support the life world of, you know, modernity's arc of globalization. When that really starts to go under, as we saw just a quake, like a little earthquake, a little shake this year, when that really begins to take hold, then I think we're going to start seeing just innovative leaps in terms of like, okay, well, how do we really do this at a municipal level, at a regional level, et cetera? And even during this pandemic crisis, we've seen that like Matt Segal was talking about in the comments, the sort of the collapse of federal faith in the federal government's response and the turning back towards state and regional responses. I'm not saying myself that like I want to promote collapse. I'm more of saying that I think decentralization, networks, and the commons are the qualities of polity of the future, right? Including economics. And if we're not going to enter that future in an enlightened way, then I think crisis and catastrophe teaches us how to enter that future the hard way. And that's sort of what I see happening right now in the United States. But in terms of like who to look at theoretically, who's interesting, you've mentioned Michelle Bowens and the Peer-to-Peer Foundation. There's a lot of peer-to-peer network organizations that are available right now. I'm really liking this book, this anthology called Patterns of Commoning, the Common Strategies Group, and it's by two editors, David Bollier and I think Silke Heffrich. And I found one particular scholar there, Andreas Weber, who I really like. I'm going to see if I can share his essay, Reality as Commons, a Poetics of Participation for the Anthropocene. I think in terms of the superordinate goal or having coherence about the future, whatever it's going to look like, it's going to look a little bit more like that than not. And again, it's not completely clear yet because in many ways we're still so deeply entrenched in capitalist realism and its collapse that it is really hard to see what the particular new state of economic dynamism is going to look like, right? We have to in some way be, again, the midwives and navigators and mediators in terms of how to get there. And that's the difficult work, I think, for our time, to just not be in the new world, right? In terms of like what Gebser talks about, we live in a Janus-faced period where the substantive strengths of the new consciousness or the new structure of consciousness are incipient and latent and not really dominant. And at the same time, the older structure is still very much having a stranglehold on our culture, our ideology, our economic and social systems of relations. All of that is still kind of in a struggle to be released from it, right, as it's collapsing. So it's a really disorienting place to inhabit, being in this sort of liminal zone, right? But just to like one more point with Jared, I mentioned this in the chat, but in terms of capitalism kind of being transcended and included, I like the idea that like Gebser talks about, or like McLuhan talks about, or even Michelle Bowens, that this future economic system and civilization would be able to utilize capitalism almost like it's miniaturized, right? There are certain projects where growth and directedness are essential, right? But they can then be folded in and sort of turned offline as needed. So the kind of dynamic responsiveness of an economy to be able to express and flex different dimensions, just like different structures of consciousness, would be where we're headed. I don't know what that looks like as a social or economic theory, but that to me would be the qualities of that theory, right? Like we can enact capitalism if we want to do a particular project at a global scale to help counteract global warming in some sense or something along those lines. But it also might look like, oh, complete steady state, no economic growth for 20 years. And how would a culture and economy be resilient enough to flourish during that time rather than collapse, right? So we need to be able to have that dynamic response to complex systems. And I think nature's just going to teach us, like the planet's going to teach us the hard way to do that. But just as in nature, though, capitalism gets folded in to whatever we're emerging into, like an organelle in the cell, right? It's no longer the center. It's a symbiotic little thing that has a place, but not in a totalizing way, right? And obviously easier said than done, right? But yeah. Man.
I'll just end with this, and it made me think when you mentioned the Janus face, it made me think of something from I think I saw it in the Joseph Campbell series of the Elephanta caves, and you have the one right in the middle, sort of integrating the two. If you guys can see that on there, to me, there's also, with all this splitting going on, fragmenting going on, it's also personally responsible for each person to maintain their center and try to, you know, integrate all these different things that are trying to split us apart personally, culturally. So definitely finding your spiritual center, I think, is of value in these uncertain times.
Yeah, I just want
Sure.
to say, Jeremy, really well said at the end, and I think that that's such a helpful way of looking at capitalism or anything in general, as it's a conscious tool that can be deployed under the necessary conditions. It's just no longer this totalizing center of the universe that we're all unconsciously subsumed into, right? And there's a sense of distance or detachment where we still include some of the basic principles or the underlying consciousness structures that make capitalism happen, right? Like abstraction, forward directness in time, investing, you know, market forces and incentives, even money itself as a kind of unit of abstraction or container and exchange of value, right? But they're no longer, we have to get over this age where money has become a signifier unto itself. And money, the only thing that matters is money, and it completely dissociates from material reality. And so some kind of harmonization either between the abstract realm of finance and capital with the material world, or something like a resource-based economy, a la the Venus Project. I have no idea how that's going to work or if that'll work, but I just, unless we're serious about warp driving to another planet, I see no alternative than how to manage, you know, living on a planet with finite resources with 7-8 billion people.
Yeah, there's a lot of really good thoughts and responses in the comments here. Someone's mentioning, Monique, talking about polytopias, which is an interesting word. We're all, and then Armando was mentioning capitalist realism kills utopian imagination. We must rehabilitate it to change history. So, and Jared's saying, you know, that for me, this points to the foundation of spiritual poverty. Money is just a proxy for human satisfaction coming from material circumstances. And elsewhere, we're talking about, you know, abstraction of the life world with the capital, and that's the perspectivalism, right? The abstract orientation of the perspectival world. And I know folks may not be familiar with some of Gebser's writing about this, but to go back to Ryan's point, like, to really read that in a deep way and to find corroborative writers that are speaking of that in their own way. So it's not just, I'm not just like trying to promote Gebser here, right? But like to really get that, that organization of perception, that what we call sense making in the sense making communities, as a kind of locus point that we've been organizing our society around. That's the hardest part to overcome. So I'm not saying we need to just go within and figure it out. Obviously, there's an environmental feedback loop, but any kind of practices that give us a sense of the possible is helpful, including, and I think this is the thing that like Latour talks about and a lot of climate activists talk about, like Ryan, what you were just saying, like barring going out and becoming space capitalists, we have to figure out another way. And the planet is going to continue to remind us in an ever increasing intensification of crises, very different, probably all very different variables and very different factors at different times in this century and in the following centuries. Like, it is going to be the ultimate defixator, right? Like, just even what happened this year, like just like everyone panicking, buying out the local food supply, and then worrying about resource chains being too centralized. With that little bit of a push, it was like nothing compared to what we're potentially going to have to deal with in terms of larger climate disruptions, larger biological, planetary forces that disrupt capitalist realism. So yeah, that's like the ultimate capitalist realism disruptor. I'm hoping that we don't just need that. Like, this was enough of a shock to get people thinking, and to kind of circle back to the need for places like the final apologetics for the emergencia, right? And sense making communities is, if those communities can be monastic containers that are experimenting with this to then try to apply them in the outside world, then I think they serve a very helpful function, right? Like William Irwin Thompson back in the 70s was using this as an argument for what he saw at the time, like Lindisfarne and the Feinhorn community and a lot of the countercultural spaces and et cetera. He called these evolutionary deems as like incubators to figure out this new civilization. If we see that as what we're doing here, then I think there could be value in it, you know. But I think we have to see what we're doing as that, you know, very coherently and expressly. I don't know where I'm going with that point besides that.
Well, one more thought just to wrap everything up. So just to loop it back a little bit to the intentional communities conversation. I think that, you know, Jordan Hall released a new YouTube series on like the Civium I don't know how to pronounce it. I think it's like Civium or something like that, where we can have these local Dunbar level number communities and also participate in a larger global mind through the internet. And so we can live in small, and I've lived in an intentional community for 3.5 years in going to college. And so I saw a lot of the benefits and drawbacks, right? The good, the bad, and the ugly. Well, I'll just say that the way that in that community, that's all everyone ever talked about or was interested in was intentional communities and the intentional community network. And Yogananda, who was the founding, you know, guru and inspirational figure of this community I was a part of called Ananda, his vision was to have a whole bunch of Dunbar number intentional communities all across the world, and they will live locally and sustainably. And then that was kind of like his vision, his utopian vision, right? And I'm all for it. I think that rallying behind an intention like spirituality or sustainability is really powerful and can be a very powerful container. The biggest drawback, though, and my concern is that can just further solidify tribal groupthink, right? And so we have to be careful as we're forming these communities that it doesn't become an insulated cult, that you're able to really participate in the local in a powerful and meaningful way with your fellow community members, and not lose sight of the bigger picture of thinking globally and getting outside of your bubble as well. And that's always my challenge to people who are in these communities, is how do we branch out and not get so siloed into this little bubble that you forget about the rest of the world. And one more thing, just to go back to Gebser and to tie it up with and about warp driving to Mars or other planets and trying to, you know, terraform Mars. Now, I really dislike that narrative. And what I find so helpful about Gebser's thinking is, I think if you really understand the full extent of perspectival consciousness, you're able to recognize in advance what are solutions that are just not feasible or reasonable, because they're just continuing the mental consciousness trajectory on an even larger scale. And I think that if we don't find or projecting that into the future that we're going to eventually colonize the cosmos, right? It's like, think about like 18th century colonialism, but just on a cosmic scale, and it's some kind of sci-fi dystopian movie. That's what the aliens were doing in Independence Day, right? And so so you can recognize in advance that that's a no-go, and really work hard at working with the sacredness of the earth and the Gaia and the biosphere that we're given here, and actualizing and concretizing the integral consciousness here where we are now, instead of projecting the mental consciousness and hoping that we're going to eventually colonize the entire universe in a cosmically unsustainable way. So that's just my last plug for understanding Gebser.
Yeah, well said. Well said. It again, as we conclude here, it's about coming down to earth. It's about growing down, right? And I think if the perspectival orientation, which is the capitalist orientation, is this let's call it this utopian projection. It's a bad utopia. It's a utopia of capital. It's a utopia of globalization, a globe with infinite vistas of new capital, right? New infinite territories of economic growth and capture. That's the kind of vision, this sort of infinite horizon of expansion. If that's the perspectival deficient state, then the kind of Latour talks about this as well. I don't think he coined this, but the counter Copernican revolution is this growing down. It's this a perspectival turn, which is a new embodiment, commons oriented, and not commons in terms of just the human being, but the biological commons as well, the community of the earth, the reorientation towards the communitas, relationality, etc. And that's really a much more, as Latour talks about as well, it's the terrestrial. That's the new attractor. The aperspectival is the terrestrial, is the etc. There's so many different words. They have different distinctions, but I think we can cohere, as you're saying, Ryan, the emergent theme of the aperspectival world. And that gives us, again, the importance for Gebser reading, that gives us the coherence to sense make, period. Like, as Michael Brooks always says, period. That is the coherence for sense making. If it doesn't lead there, we know our sense making is off, right? Like, if we're getting more into abstract stuff, if we're reifying or being apologetics for the way things are, then it's not sufficiently clarified enough, right? And this takes a lot of inner work and a lot of theoretical work, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, this was a good chat, guys. We had some great feedback, so let's try to do this again soon. Aquatonic says, do any of you have children?
Yes, I have 2 children.
Yep, I don't.
I have goats. Do goat kids count?
I have cats.
Absolutely, Ryan.
My wife.
Absolutely.
And I have 7 kids.
There we go.
But yeah, I just want to say thank you to everyone participating in the chat, and it really added a lot of energy and
Yes.
insight to the conversation. So thank you for your presence here today.
Yeah, thanks everybody. We'll do this again soon. Bye.